And ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Tom Campbell.
Thank you, Vaz, for that very nice introduction. I'm Tom Campbell. The subject tonight is physics, metaphysics, and the nature of consciousness. I welcome all of you. I see a few faces that I recognize from last night. Some of you are gluttons for punishment. Welcome back again. Before I get started, I would like to thank Donna Aveni Warner and Keith Warner and the London College of Spirituality for making all of this possible. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak to this group, and I assure you that what you're going to hear tonight is something that you have not heard before, except those of you that came last night. To optimally understand what I'm going to tell you tonight is going to require two things of you. You need to be open-minded, and you need to be skeptical. Both are very important. Open-minded because the big picture that I'm going to present tonight will require you to transcend old paradigms, to leap over cultural beliefs and personal beliefs, because that's the nature of breakthrough. Skeptical because without skepticism, you cannot convert belief into knowledge. Okay, believing what I tell you does not create a fundamental knowing that it's true. Only experience can do that. First, some introductory remarks. I was invited here because I wrote this book. My Big Toe Trilogy, Unifying Philosophy, Physics, and Metaphysics. People are finding that it delivers what the cover promises, and that's been attracting some attention. And because of that attention, I ended up here tonight. I've studied consciousness from both the inside and the outside for 35 years, actually over 35 years now. And I say from the outside, that means in a laboratory setting with subjects, where you ask those subjects what experience they're having and delve into their consciousness. But more important, from the inside, I've studied through my own consciousness. Consciousness is personal. Consciousness is something that you cannot get the fundamental nature of intellectually. It's not something you can get in a lecture or read in a book. It's something you have to experience. I'm also a physicist, and as such, I've carried my scientific attitude and scientific approach to my study of consciousness. Unfortunately, that seems to be a rare combination. A scientist who is also a seasoned explorer of inner space, and one who has taken his scientific methodology and tools with him. You know, I'm going to show you a lot of charts tonight. There's 38 charts, and I don't want you to feel obligated to read them. Okay, I'll tell you everything that you need to know. The charts are there for three reasons. One, they're there for me so that they keep me straight on what it is I'm going to say and the order I'm going to say it in. They're there for you because these days, particularly in big urban centers like this, we find that our attention spans are growing shorter and we learn to parallel process all the time. So for those of you who parallel process, that means do more than two things at once continually. These charts will give you something to do while you listen to me. The last reason is for the record. It's important that when the words are no longer bouncing off the walls, that a record remains that other people can pick up and read and actually make sense out of. And just a few pretty pictures and a couple of words don't do that. So there's a lot of words on these charts. Sometimes the charts will say basically what I'm saying, and sometimes they won't. But look at them if you wish. But if you just listen, you'll get it all just the same. Okay, the lecture charts will be available. You'll be able to get them on the website, and you'll be able to get them from the College of Spirituality. Also, we're doing videos here, you see, and the videos will be available. It'll probably show up on YouTube, or you can get it at my website, or again, you can get it through the College of Spirituality. So that will probably be a month before that will be available. It should be available then. Please hold your questions till the end. It's going to be a big rush for me to get through this in 90 minutes. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to start slow so that you'll get used to the funny way I speak English. But I'm going to speed up as I go. And if you have trouble following me, or if you have trouble hearing, or there's some sort of issue like that, please just raise your hand and wave it in the air, and I'll try to slow down or enunciate more clearly or something to accommodate. I won't have the ability to do anything tonight except skim over the top. We're going to talk about some of the results and conclusions, some of the fundamental principles here, but the logic and the science that backs these up will have to be gotten into books. That's just too much. I can't get into all of that. After all, that did take about 850 pages, and I can't do that in 90 minutes. I can't talk that fast. So remember, you're just skimming over the top here, and there'll be a lot of things that won't have any logical backing, but there is logical backing. There's nothing I'm going to tell you that doesn't have a good logical or scientific backing behind it. Okay, let's get started. A TOE means theory of everything. Now, Einstein started the first TOE, or the first scientific TOE anyway. It was called unified field theory, and what he was trying to do was to get one overarching understanding, one set of equations that combined or that could derive both general relativity and quantum mechanics. Those were the two big, and still are, the two big areas of science that define what reality is like. Well, he failed. He did not succeed. He worked on it the whole last half of his career, about 20 years or so. He worked on this problem, and he got very close. He got to where he knew where the answer laid. He could tell that it had to be this way. It was through that door. He got right up to the doorway, but he couldn't open it. He couldn't quite get there, but I'll read you some quotes from him a little later that will show you the ideas he had where he got stopped. Okay. Now, Einstein had to produce a TOE that described all objective experience. That was what he was looking for. I would call that a little TOE, and a little picture that gets described all objective experience. A big TOE has to describe all experience, not just objective experience. That means subjective experience. Okay, that's a big picture. Okay, objective experience is all about the stuff. Subjective experience is about the meaning and the significance, the point, the purpose. Objective experience is about what we do, what we see, touch, hear, smell. Subjective experience is why we do it. You know, what's the significance of it to us? It's about who we are, the person that lives inside. Now, some scientists believe that only the little picture is real, that the subjective is not real. Other scientists believe that the subjective may be real, but it's just not important because science can't deal with the subjective. It can only deal with the objective. Okay. The opposite is true. The subjective is fundamentally more real than is the objective. Okay, now for most of us, we understand that. In other words, the meaning, the significance, the point and purpose of our lives, you know, who we are, the person that lives inside, why we do what we do. We have an intuitive sense that this is what's really important in our life, not the stuff. The stuff is really just the stage and the props upon which what is significant in us acts out our story. Okay. Oh, that reminds me to start this. Okay. All right. I'll try to keep us on time. I don't want to eat into your question and answer session. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about logical sets and systems. First, take a look at this chart. And this is a larger system. This is a subsystem. Okay, now the subsystem is basically our universe and everything in it. So that's you and me and everything in the universe. So it deals with the normal, the physical, the objective, and matter. That's what it can deal with. That's what it's made of. Okay, the larger system has to contain also not just normal, but the paranormal, not only the physical, but the non-physical, subjective, mind, and then metaphysics here, theology. All those things are part of the larger reality, and an important part. But we have to make this assume there is a larger reality, and a little later I'll make the assumption that that larger reality is consciousness. But many would say, well, that's a pretty big assumption. You've really stepped out to assume that there's a larger reality. And some would say it was a pretty large leap of faith. But I will show you later as we go along that the leap is really not a very big leap. It's a pretty small leap, and it doesn't take much faith to get there. The point to make about this system and a subsystem is that you can never describe the larger system from information that's inside the subsystem. Okay, that should make sense to you. When you're in a subsystem or you have the information that's a piece of the larger system, that does not allow you. You don't have enough information to describe what's going on in the larger system because you don't have enough information. If you want to know something about the larger system, the only way to do that is to experience it. Okay? You can't do that from just staying inside the subsystem. You have to get out of that box. Okay, now I have just two assumptions with this, and of course models and theories always come with assumptions. I have just two, and one of them is that consciousness exists and constitutes the larger reality. That's that leap we were talking about. The second one is that the process of evolution exists and directs and encourages change toward more profitable states of being. And I'm talking about a very general concept of evolution, not just biological evolution on this planet. Technology evolves, businesses evolve, cultures evolve, all sorts of things evolve, right? They exist, they change based on more profitable states, depending on what's profitable. You have a criteria for profitability. Biological systems, that criteria is survival and procreation. For a consciousness system, that criteria is entropy reduction. Now, entropy is probably a new word to some of you. It's a science term. I'll try to make a very simple definition out of it. There's two ways to look at entropy. One is that it is a measure of disorder. Okay? A measure of disorder. The other is that if you have, well, let's go back to disorder. If you have high entropy, that means there's more disorder. Okay? If you have low entropy, there's less disorder. Another way to look at it is the amount of energy that's available to do work, to do something, to cause some effect. And if you have low entropy, you have more order and you have energy that can do work, have an effect. If you have high entropy, you have more disorder and you have energy, or you have a system that is incapable of making change, of doing work. Okay, an example. Let's take an example of a jug of water. Okay, if you had a jug of water, you could do something with it. Okay, the molecules are all arranged in a very compact way. That's why we have a liquid. You could pour it over a little paddle wheel and make electricity. You could drink it. You could drop it on your foot and break your toe. Wouldn't be a good thing to do, but it has energy. It could make things happen. It can change things as a bottle of water. Pull out the cork, let the water sit, and come back in a month and there would be no water. The water's gone. It's all evaporated. Now, that system, being the water, being a system, has high entropy. It's dispersed all through the atmosphere. It can't do anything anymore. It can't break your toe. You can't drink it. It does no longer have the energy. You can't generate electricity from it. It no longer has the ability to do work because it has so much disorder in it. Now, that's fundamentally the concept of entropy. Okay, now a theory is valuable and only valuable if it meets four criteria. Okay, and again, all theories have assumptions. You don't judge a theory based on what you think of its assumptions. That falls under the heading of closed-minded. You judge a theory based on what that theory is able to do. One, it has to have the fewest possible assumptions. If your theory has to have a lot of assumptions to prop it up or to explain it, then it's probably not true, certainly not fundamentally true. Secondly, it has to derive all the old answers. You have to take that theory and derive everything that you know to be true already. Thirdly, it has to derive new answers. It has to have predictions of new things. And lastly, those new answers have to be shown to be correct experimentally. Okay? If you have a theory or a model that does that, then you say that the model and its assumptions accurately model reality. Okay? Again, the thought with this slide is that one cannot define the system in terms of the subsystem. To define the system, one must experience it. Simple idea, but many people miss that. Okay, so now I've actually put consciousness in that block, and I'm going to jump right away to the very bottom of the bottom lines, and then we'll go back a little bit after that. Again, we see consciousness as the system. We see our universe as the subsystem, except now instead of the big thing, it's this little white spot here. And I did that on purpose because in reality, if I tried to make the sizes on this chart relative to the, or accurate in terms of the size of information or content, then I'm afraid our whole physical universe would be probably less than a pixel, and it wouldn't show up on that chart. The point I'm making is that our physical universe within the whole consciousness reality is a very, very tiny, a very small thing. There's much more information and content in the larger reality than there just is in our universe. Okay, now, keep those 4 things in mind, I said, that makes a theory a good one. MBT, which is short for my big toe, again, this is the bottom of the bottom lines. MBT's physical reality model better explains the objective data. It better explains physics. Okay? It derives quantum mechanics in the sense that it tells you why quantum mechanics has to be the way it is, why at the lowest level of particle you end up with, not particle, but a probability distribution. It says that's what you'd have to end up with. That makes sense. And it answers the mysteries of physics like entanglement, wave-particle duality. Those kinds of things come out as a natural consequence of this theory. And also MBT explains the non-physical, the origins, existence, purpose, mechanics of the non-physical, paranormal, mind, consciousness, metaphysics, philosophy, and even theology. I know that sounds strange, but that is the way it is. Now, the physical reality is best modeled as a virtual digital reality. That's how it's modeled in my big toe. And consciousness is best modeled as a digital information system. Okay. We're going to do physics first, and then we'll do metaphysics. Physics. The main piece of physics that is probing at the fundamentals of reality right now is quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics basically sees particles as probability distributions. It sees the fundamentals of our existence as a probability distribution. You've probably heard of the double slit experiment. It's kind of a famous thing in physics, but some of you are probably not physicists, so I'll run over it anyway. In the double slit experiment, you can think of it a board, and it's got 2 slits in it, and then there's a screen behind it. And you throw a photon at that board, and what you get on the screen behind it is a wave pattern. A wave pattern is a series of light that's a bright light, or a little bright light in the center, and then from either side of the center there's dark, and then you get a little bright spot, and dark and bright spot, and you have these spots. That's a wave pattern. Okay, and why do you get a wave pattern? You get a wave pattern because this photon is really not a particle, but it's a probability distribution. It only has a probability of existing at any particular place. Because of that, it has a certain amount of probability of going through this slit or going through that slit. Well, it goes through both because it has a probability of going through one or the other. I mean, both. It goes through both. It interferes with itself on the other side. You get a wave distribution on the screen behind you. Now, physicists saw that and were much confused by it, so they did an experiment. They said, well, let's see what's really going on in those slits. So they measured, they put a device in there, a sensor, let's say, that could tell you which slit that photon went through, or did it actually go through both. When they did that, the photon just went through one slit, didn't make a wave pattern, made a little spot of light behind that slit. Okay? Or it went through the other slit and made a little spot of light behind that slit, but no wave patterns. Okay, so they thought, wow, that changes the results of the experiment if we look and see what's going on. Looking is the same as a measurement. Okay, so then they said, let's not look, but let's leave the equipment. Maybe it's the equipment that's doing it. So you leave the sensors where they are, but you just turn off the power to what's recording the data. So now the sensors are still in place, but they're not recording anything. What do you think happens? It goes through both slits. You get a wave pattern on the other side. Okay, that's the double slit experiment. Well, that created a thing called wave-particle duality. Is a photon a particle or is it a wave? And the answer to that was, well, it's both. Sometimes it's a wave and sometimes it's a particle. It's a wave if you don't look. It's a particle if you do. And, of course, the physicists are saying, well, what does looking have to do with it? You know, this was a big problem. You know, so quantum mechanics has really kind of turned physics on its head. And that's called the measurement problem. Okay, and out of that comes, you know, entangled pairs and other phenomena that are mysterious to physicists. Okay, now there are many interpretations of why it does this and what it means. A lot of physicists have been trying. Now, this was started back in the late 20s, in the 30s. All of this was a big deal, and physicists were working very hard on this. They're still a big deal and working hard on it. They haven't really made any progress since the 20s and 30s, made very little real progress. And all of the theories of what does it mean, what is it saying about reality, none of them have made it into the center of physics. They're all on the fringe. I'll just talk about a couple of them. The one that's most common is called the Copenhagen interpretation. Basically what it says is that if you have a probability of being in n states, when you measure it, you just get a random value. One of those states, randomly, you get that, you measure that value. Okay, then there's one that says consciousness causes collapse, and that comes from the idea that you have to be aware, you have to measure it. Some consciousness has to take a measurement, and that causes it to collapse to the measured value. Now, when I say collapse, it's a wave function. They talk about wave functions, but it's really probability wave is what we're talking about. Cause it to collapse to a certain value. Another one is called consistent histories. And that says, well, it's not random state that it collapses to. It's a state based on what happened before, what its history was. And then there's one of many worlds. And I have to mention that David Deutsch at Oxford is one of your countrymen. He's one of the foremost researchers in the many worlds area. Actually, he's published some very good work just recently on this, made some progress. The many worlds says that, all right, you have n states that it could be in. That means it's probability function. In quantum mechanics, you don't necessarily have a smeared continuous probability. There's a probability only certain states can exist. So if there's n states, he says all n of them happen. Everything can happen does happen, except the one that happens in this reality, is where we live. The ones that happen in other parallel realities, we don't know about. But there is a separate physical parallel reality for every state. Well, of course, there's billions of states. Every electron has multiple states. There's a lot of electrons. So, there's a problem. There's a problem here as well. The problem, of course, that they had with the Copenhagen one is that if it's just a random choice, then that creates two problems. One, all of this reality that we see before us is based upon random choices. That does not compute. Also, that means that if you do the same experiment twice, you won't get the same answer. Well, physicists don't like that either. So both of those were problems. That's why I say none of these theories are problem-free. Okay, there was another one called Many Minds. It was sort of a combination of consciousness causes collapse and many worlds. And basically, it said that the many worlds weren't physical, but they were mental. Okay. Now, I didn't expect you to read this. I can't even read this, and I'm closer than you are. What this says is that there are interpretations of what quantum mechanics means down here. I have 13 of them, a baker's dozen. There's another 13 that didn't make this chart. There's lots of them. It's not like there's only 13. It's kind of the top 13. And across here are different measures of quality, or different measures of the quantum mechanics event. Like, is there a role for the observer? Does it have a collapsing wave function? They're hidden variables. These are all physics terms that the physicists work with. And what I wanted you to see is basically the patchwork. There's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a no's and yeses all over. In other words, nobody really has an idea. It's just a big mystery. Next. All right, now there's other big pictures besides that one. Edward Fredkin created digital physics in 1992 when he published two papers. The first one was Finite Nature. The second was A New Cosmogony. And Edward Fredkin is really a pretty high-powered physicist. He was a physicist at MIT, then went to Boston University. Now he's in Carnegie Mellon. He's kind of specialized in the digital side of information theory and physics. And his conclusions were that reality is a computed simulation, that we are in a computed simulation. And he presented this paper at a scientific forum and was not received real well. I think probably didn't get a long applause. It kind of startled a lot of people. But he was a very brave man for doing that. But he had solid physics to back it up. That's why he stood up and did it. Essentially, he says our reality is digital. Time's digital. Space is digital. Essentially, it's informational. He says our reality is just information. Okay. He also said that because a system cannot compute itself, it must be computed in, his words, other. It was computed in other. Okay, he didn't want to go there where it was computed. He knew it couldn't be computed in this reality frame. Okay, so he says it came from a reality frame that's outside of our physical reality. Well, now how do we define non-physical reality? Non-physical reality is basically other, is it not? We have a physical matter reality. That's our universe. That's us. There's everything in the universe, and then there's everything else. And that's non-physical reality. So everything is not physical in that concept's non-physical. So if this is in other, then with that definition, he's basically saying that it's computed in a non-physical. Even if you say some other physical reality that isn't physical, that's cheating. It's the non-physical is what he was talking about. Now, next came Nick Bostrom, and he had his PhD from this very institution, from London School of Economics. He's now at Oxford. He was at Princeton, I believe, and he's another physicist. He's a physicist and a philosopher, has degrees in both. He wrote a paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And he just went through it logically, and he found that it was impossible to say that it was impossible. Then he found out that it was unlikely to say that it was unlikely. That left him with the conclusion that certainly almost all of us are living in a simulation. He said it was very likely. Now, in his mind, the simulation is done from some other physical thing that's outside of what's physical. So he wouldn't say that it's non-physical, but that's where it lands. It's beyond, it's some other physical place besides ours. That's how physicists say non-physical without using that word. So that was his conclusion. Then Brian Whitworth, I included him because he was the last one to publish a paper on this. This is a current thing going on. His paper was called The Physical World as a Virtual Reality. Okay, now he didn't worry about what other was or even why our reality might be digital. He just looked at it and said, well, let's just assume that it is digital. How does that theory work? How does it do with our physics? Does it, these four things I told you that make a theory a good theory, does it answer, everything we know? Does it have new predictions? Make it a better theory than what we have? His conclusion in his paper was, yes, it's a better theory. And he made it very clear. It was a pretty complete paper, and again presented in a physics environment, published in a physics journal. So not very many people have heard anything that Fredkin or Bostrom or Whitworth have said, and it's on the internet, but probably 0.01% of the population of this planet will ever read anything published in a physics journal. So that's why I added the last guy, Jim Elvidge. He now has written a book for everybody. He's taken this idea of a digital reality, a simulated reality, and he's popularized it. The book's just out. I haven't read it. I just kind of looked over a little bit, looked at the website, and he clearly is making a case that the scientists have already made. He's bringing it and putting it into the common language for everybody. Okay. All right, now we're going to go to the really big guns. Albert Einstein, of course. I'm going to read you a few quotes from Albert Einstein. These are quotes toward the end of his career where he had been working on his unified field theory for about 20 years. At this point, he had come to some very solid conclusions about where the answer lay, but he just couldn't get there. One of his conclusions was that space does not have an independent existence. Now, that's pretty profound. Space does not have an independent existence, he said. Reality is merely an illusion, albeit, he said, a very persistent one. He says, hence it is clear that the space of physics is not, in the last analysis, anything given in nature or independent of human thought. It is a function of our conceptual scheme. Space is a function of mind. Space is conceived by Newton, proved to be an illusion. Okay? Now, this is not just some crazy physicist from Huntsville, Alabama telling you this. This is Albert Einstein, probably the best scientific mind that our collective human gene pool has ever created. So you have to give this guy some respect when he's spent 20 years studying this, and these are his conclusions. Okay, now David Bohm, he was a physicist that studied and worked with Einstein. He and Einstein were collaborators on this theory. David Bohm wrote, "To meet the challenge before us, our notions of cosmology and the general nature of reality must have room in them to permit a consistent account of consciousness." Okay? Physics needs a consistent account of consciousness. Vice versa, our notions of consciousness must have room in them to understand what it means for its content, the content of consciousness, to be reality as a whole. Okay? The two sets of notions together should then be such as to allow for an understanding as how consciousness and reality are related. Okay, now here's one from Einstein, written back a letter to David Bohm. It said, "One has to find a possibility to avoid the continuum together with space and time altogether, but I have not the slightest idea what kind of elementary concepts could be used in such a theory." Okay. And the very last one I'll quote is Eugene Wigner. He's a Nobel Prize winner, also one of the physicists who was at the forefront of quantum mechanics back in the 20s and 30s. "It will remain remarkable in whatever way our future concepts may develop that the very study of the external world," now he's talking about quantum mechanics here, "led to the scientific conclusion that the content of the consciousness is the ultimate universal reality." Okay, well, remember our assumption that there is a larger system, and that system is consciousness? Well, it doesn't sound like maybe it's that great a leap from what some of the best thinkers and best scientists, that we know of, conclusions that they came to. So maybe the leap isn't quite as wild a leap as you might have thought in the beginning. Okay, these guys were two of the best, Bohm and Einstein. They were looking for that larger system for their unified field theory, but they didn't understand digital. Digital science back in the 20s and 30s was either non-existent or just barely becoming existent at that point. So Einstein said he had to avoid the continuum. He couldn't conceive of digital simulation. This just wasn't in his worldview. So he could not do that. They didn't imagine that consciousness, they knew consciousness was part of the answer. They knew that had to be, but they didn't know that consciousness was the computer, that consciousness by its nature is digital. They didn't understand the nature of consciousness because to understand consciousness, as I said when we started, you have to experience it. You can't understand this intellectually. Consciousness is not an objective system. It's a subjective system. It's inside. Each of you are conscious. Your consciousness is subjective. It's your own. It's not an objective thing. So if you understand consciousness, trying to understand it objectively is being inside that little subsystem, trying to understand the big system. Can't be done. It's illogical. You have to get outside of that box or you can't understand the larger system. Okay, because of my many years of research in consciousness and explorations of consciousness, and because I'm familiar with physics and digital science, I was able to go where they were stopped. Now I know what you're probably thinking after I said that. If I were sitting out there and were you, this is what I would be thinking. So if you've really figured this all out, why haven't we seen your name in lights? It's a good question. It's a very good question. Well, there's a couple of reasons. I think they're good reasons. You get to make your own decision about that. One, it's all very new. Okay, this is kind of news, almost before it happens. This is very new concepts. There's very few physicists. There's probably a couple of dozen, but there's not a lot of physicists. There's not a lot of people of any sort that heard these views because it's all so very, very new. Okay, you're right on the cutting edge here. Also, reality concepts are very slow growers because they require major fundamental paradigm shifts, not just one, but several to get here. And those things don't happen quickly. Goodness, quantum mechanics has been around now for, since, like I say, the 20s and 30s, these things have been argued. And there's still no conclusion. Fredkin, since 92, for 20 years, more than 20 years, 25 years, he's made these statements. Science shows that what he said, physics backs it up very clearly. And not a whole lot's happened. It's just slowly growing. Now there's a movement called digital physics, and there are digital physicists probably in every country on the planet. It does spread, but it spreads very, very slowly. So 20 years later, 25 years later, it's just creeping along a little bit at a time because it lies outside of the mainstream. Okay, secondly, I'm not an academic physicist. I work in the real world. Now, what I mean by that is that I do applied physics. Okay, I don't do theoretical physics for a living, but applied physics. Now, outsiders get very little credibility from insiders, and that's true no matter what organization you're in. It's just a fact of life. Also, I appear to have done the impossible. Well, let me rephrase it. I appear to be claiming to have done the impossible. Okay? What that means is that when you mix traditional science, just the objective, with a science that takes in philosophy, metaphysics, the subjective, and then you say that horrible word in scientific circles, paranormal, and things like that, well, you lose most of your audience immediately. They just turn that off, saying, this doesn't mean anything, and they don't go forward. So that's a big problem. But it is not impossible. You can scientifically. When I say I describe the non-physical, I don't mean I describe it in poetry and I describe it with a lot of words. I mean I describe it logically and scientifically. It's a logical process. Okay. So, why am I here rather than writing science papers for scientists? That's because if I were doing a little toe, then I wouldn't be here. I'd be writing science papers and delivering them to science, forums. But this is not a little toe. This is a big toe. This has to do with the subjective and consciousness. It has to do with meaning, purpose. All these things are very important to everybody. They're not just important to physicists. They're very important to everyone. So I decided that I would kind of start by writing books that were at the level of everyone. You don't have to have any kind of prerequisites at all to read these books. They're just written for the common person. And I started there, and I figured the scientists would come along by and by because the truth is not fragile. It is not fragile. It can take whatever. When Darwin produced his theory of evolution, he was caricatured as a monkey. And people found it ridiculous. When Einstein first got up and talked about special relativity, they thought he was ridiculous. He was laughed at as well. Said, that's silly. That couldn't possibly be that way. It doesn't make any sense. Well, 10 years later, Einstein got the last laugh because the experiments confirmed his theory. In any case, that's just the way it is. It's a slow-going thing, and rather than have this all tied up in a physics forum for the next 20 years, it's too important to do that. So here I am. Okay, next question. How did a nice physicist like me end up giving a lecture like this? Obviously, you have to have walked a little bit on the strange side, on the wild side to get here. This is what happened to me. I just got out of graduate school, and I got my graduate degrees in physics, and did my thesis work in experimental nuclear physics. Never did work in the academic environment. Went right into the real world for a job. About 3 weeks into my first job, and my boss comes up, throws a book at me, and he says, Tom, read this. Well, when your boss says, read this, you go read it right away. So I did, and the name of the book was Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. Strange thing to throw at me, but I read it, and about another month went by, and the boss comes back, and he says, well, what did you think? And I was a little worried about the answer. I thought maybe this was a test, but I'd only been there 3 weeks. But it wasn't. He had read it. He was very curious. I was a physicist. He wanted to know what my take was. And I told him honestly what I thought about it. I said, well, if this guy Monroe is just making all this up to sell books, he's got a good imagination. It was an interesting read. But, how do you know? If it, on the other hand, he really did experience these things, he really did do this research, he did the experiments he said he did and collected this data, if that's real, then, that's a capital, W, capital O, capital W exclamation mark. That's exciting because that says there's another whole part of reality that we don't know anything about. I'm a physicist. What I do is model reality. That's what physicists do. We're interested in reality and how it works. Well, if there's another whole piece of it that we don't even know about, that's a pretty exciting idea if it's true. So my thought was, how do you ever know? You don't know whether this guy's making it up or not. Well, it turned out about 2 or 3 months later, the boss comes in and say, hey, we've located Bob Monroe. He doesn't live that far away. We're all going out to see him. Would you like to join us? Well, it couldn't have kept me away from that trip for anything. Of course, I went, and it turned out at that time, Bob was just finishing building a lab. He wanted to study consciousness. The reason he wanted to study consciousness is he wanted to be respectable again. He wanted to have this turn out to be science. You know, this just happened to him. He didn't ask for it. He didn't try to do it. There's probably some of you who've been trying to do this for a while and, you know, haven't had success, but he was trying not to do it. It scared him to death. He thought he was going insane. He couldn't not do it. It just happened. So he worked with it. He experimented with it. And then he realized, hey, this is real, because he could go get information that he had no access to otherwise, and he could check on it, and sure enough, that was right. And he did a lot of this experiment to where he realized that he wasn't insane. He was doing something that was way off the beaten track, but it was real. Okay, he was looking for scientists at that time to man his lab, actually to create it. All he had was an empty building. So myself and my friend Dennis Menerick, we shot our hands up and said, yes, we'll be your scientists, we'll build your equipment, we'll do your protocols, we'll make sure that the results are credible, and we won't charge you a penny for all that. What we want is for you to teach us to do what you do, because we didn't think that we could really understand it from the outside. We thought we had to experience it so that we knew what was going on. So there wasn't anybody slipping anything tricky on us. You know, there wasn't any con going on. If we were doing it ourselves, then we would believe it ourselves. It's that sort of thing. You have to get personally involved. So Bob took us up on it, and for the next 5 years or so, we spent 20 to 30 hours a week with Bob Monroe. About a third of that time we were building equipment, setting up his lab, coming up with protocols, working to generate the tools that he would need. The other 2/3 of it, Bob was teaching us what he knew. Okay, after we mastered out-of-body experience, we were doing all these things, doing experiments. Of course, every experiment had to have some evidential thing. There wasn't point in doing something that you couldn't then go back and prove that what you had done actually did happen. You must collect evidence as you go. If you don't collect evidence as you go, you'll never know what you're doing. You'll never know whether what you're experiencing is real or whether you're just have a good imagination and you're making it up. So you have to do science. Now the question might come up, can you do science in the subjective, or is science only limited to the objective? Well, most of your scientists would say it's only limited to the objective, but that's because they're not thinking very broadly. We do science in the subjective realm all the time. Generally, we do it with statistics. The example I'll give you is you have a headache, you take a pill. Your headache goes away. Well, did the pill take the headache away, or did the headache just go away anyway, and the pill was irrelevant? Well, it's impossible to do that as an objective experiment, because you cannot both take the pill and not take the pill at the same time. It's impossible. It can't be done objectively. Well, how do you solve the problem? You solve the problem by giving 100 people or 1,000 people with a headache the pill. Now you can find out whether or not the pill really works or not, because all 1,000 aren't going to just happen to have it go away right after they took the pill, and well, that was just circumstance. If you get that kind of a result, then you know the pill is working. Well, that's how pharmaceuticals find out whether their drugs work or not, right? That's the only way they can do that. That's the only way most medicine works. That's the way almost all of psychology works when it does its research. They do it by inference from statistics. It's not deductive logic, it's inductive logic, and it comes out with scientific results. You have to do this the same way. You can't just try to heal someone with your mind and then they get better and say, oh, I can heal people with my mind. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. You need to heal 1,000 people. And you need to keep statistics on how many of them get better when you do that. How many get better right afterwards. You may have to do 2,000 people if you're not sure. You do it until you've collected enough data that you can say that you are having an effect and that your effect is real. Well, actually what you're saying is that your effect is likely. Your effect is probable. You can say, statistics get expressed in terms of probability. You say the fact that this person now got well after I healed them has a You know, there's a 1 chance in 1,000 that would have happened randomly. You can say those kinds of things when you do statistically. You never get to the point that you can say yes because it's not objective. You can't tell. But you can say, I do this a lot and I always get results. You can get the statistics. You have to do the statistics. Okay, well, when you learn something like this, you don't walk away from it. It goes on. And like anything, the more you know, the easier it is to know more. So it accelerates. Learning accelerates. I'm a physicist, so I continually work for the next 30-some years to find out how this thing worked, doing experiments in that larger reality, basically to find out what the physics was in that larger reality. That larger reality of consciousness has rules. It has its own causality, and you have to do experiments there to find out what it is. So that's what I'd been doing for the last 30 years, and at the end of it all, I did this publication, My Big Toe. I have to tell you that it had to be an inside job to come to this conclusion. You could never have figured this out objectively from the outside. That's why Einstein was stuck. He could not do it from the outside. Consciousness is a subjective thing. You can't study it intellectually and understand it. You have to experience it. Okay, so reality, system of consciousness. Consciousness is the media of reality. Okay? Information is the content of reality. I say these real slow because these are big ideas. Entropy is the evolutionary motivator of consciousness. Okay, fundamental reality is modeled as a system of digital consciousness. Now think about it for a minute. That sounds really weird to those of you who've been working in consciousness, you know, simulation, digital consciousness, you know, what is this? This is a scientist gone mad, right? It makes sense. Think of what consciousness is. Experience, right, is the first component of consciousness. There's 4 things that make up consciousness. One is experience. Well, what's experience? Experience is the experience we're having in this room, right? You look at me and I'm looking at you and we see light that comes through our eyes, through the lens, to the retina, into the optic nerve. Well, what is that light? It's just data. When it gets into the optic nerve, what is it? It's electrical pulses. It's neurons, patterns of neurons. It's just data. Okay? Memory. Well, memory, you know, that's just like data storage, right? You've got data and you store it someplace. That's data storage. Processing. Okay, now you have to have memory, otherwise every experience would be the first. So, you know, memory is very important for consciousness. Processing is important for consciousness because processing looks at the data and finds patterns. It finds patterns in the experience. That way you can make sense of the experience. And the last thing you have to define consciousness is there has to be a self-modifying feedback loop. In other words, you have to be able to learn. So you stick your finger in the fire and it hurts and you pull it back out, right? You put the finger in the fire, you got data, right? And that data was little electrical pulses running up the nerves and into the brain. And that data that got stored in there someplace in your memory, okay, you processed on it and said, oh, bad thing to do. You looked at that, you came to that conclusion, wasn't healthy. Then you have this self-modifying feedback that says, don't do it again. You know, and it changes then the way you act. You don't do that again. You've modified your experience. You don't do the same thing over. All right, now all of the above attributes are all about information. Okay? So you think about information is data. You're a consciousness. You just have data coming in to your consciousness. Okay, now think about it this way. If we could get somehow, some magical way, if I could stimulate your optic nerve so that you would, exactly in the same way that it's being stimulated now, with me standing up here talking to you, if I could stimulate that somehow, put you in some dark hole, right, and seal it up, but stimulate that optic nerve exactly the way it's being stimulated now, what would you see? You'd see exactly what you're seeing now. And could you tell that it was different? Could you tell that you were not in a deep, dark hole? No. Because whatever's on that optic nerve goes to that brain, it gets interpreted as what you're seeing. So if I can reproduce those signals, if I can reproduce that data, I'll reproduce your experience. There's no way to tell the difference. Okay, so your experience is just data coming into your consciousness. That's it. Okay, next. At the root, we've got information. This is one that will surprise you. Information is non-physical. That seems weird. We're surrounded by information. We all have information overload. We live in the information age, but information is non-physical. Information is the meaning, the content, the significance, not the media or the code symbols. If you look at a book, the paper's the media. All the little words, the ink marks inside the book are the code symbols. That's not information. Okay? That's coded. You know, the information's in a code and put in the media. Information is what those code symbols mean. What's the content? What's the significance of them? That's the information that you get from the book. What you get from the book isn't little ink squiggles, and it isn't paper. It's meaning, it's content. Information is non-physical. It's meaning, content, significance, and you need a consciousness to get information. Right? Because a consciousness is where content, significance, and meaning comes from. Okay? You can take a machine, you take a camera and look at that book and that page, and does the camera get the meaning, the content, the significance? No. Does it see the type and does it see the paper? Sure. But it's not conscious. There's no meaning. So what we get from that is that consciousness is information. Okay? That's what that means. Information requires lower entropy organization of code symbols. You can't just take the alphabet and put a random display of letters out there and you don't get information. To make information out of it, they have to be organized. Well, remember, organized is lower entropy. All right? At the most fundamental level, consciousness is information. Information is non-physical, thus consciousness is non-physical. At the most fundamental level, information is bits. And at the most fundamental level, bits are digital and binary, a 1 or a 0, an off or an on, a yes or a no, up or down, whatever. What's the logical consequence of these statements? A consciousness system is best modeled at its most fundamental level by a digital information system. Weird, yes, but it fits the data. Consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy, okay, by improving the value, the useful information content of its bits. So here's consciousness. You know, you put your hand in that fire, right, and then you pulled it out. So not only, you know, you learn from that experience. When you learn from that experience, now you know better. Well, what have you done? You've just increased the informational content of your consciousness. You've learned something. You know not to do that anymore. You've arranged the bits at your disposal into a configuration that is a little more useful to you than before. Before, you didn't know not to stick your finger in that fire. Now you do. So you've rearranged your informational bits into a configuration that's more powerful for you, more helpful, okay, more useful. All right. Here's a summary of where we are so far, because these are difficult concepts to get your arms around. The larger consciousness system evolves by lowering the entropy of the system. It lowers the entropy of the system by organizing the bits at its disposal in a more profitable configuration. New bits and organizational opportunities are generated by using consciousness intent to apply free will choice to incoming experience data. Okay, and the feedback of the results of previous choice allow us to modify. Now, there's a little bit of new material in there. Generated, you know, you have to have experience, right? It's all based on experience. And the experience, you have to have free will. If you don't have free will, you can't learn. You know, you're just following a script. That's not learning. In order to learn, you have to stick your finger into that fire. Then you learn something. If you don't have free will, whether you stick your finger in your fire is irrelevant, because you're just following a pattern. You know, it doesn't matter. You're not learning anything. It's impossible to learn or to grow if you don't have free will. Okay, next. All right, we've done some physics. Now let's do some metaphysics. We're going to talk about experience and the role that experience has. Okay, the experience is the generator of the input for consciousness, right? Okay, now just think of it as one big consciousness. Where's it going to get its experience? You have to just interact with itself. That could get boring. It also would be slow. It also would be very limited. Okay, so what does it do? it creates smaller units of consciousness that are constrained. They don't have all the knowledge or all the data or all the bits. They just have some of the bits. Okay? And they're constrained. And they create a lot of them and let them interact. Now, as they're interacting, if you've got 1,000 of these things interacting with free will, now you have just multiplied the amount of experience by 1,000. Instead of one thing interacting with itself, you have 1,000 things interacting with each other. The possibilities go way up, you see, because now we have a lot of different things going. So what are the possible interactions here? The possible ways to learn? They're much greater than one thing by itself. Okay, well, who are these little things that are interacting with each other? They're you and me. They're beings that are conscious. All right? Okay, now what are they doing? They're lowering their entropy by interacting. Okay, and this concept, we'll take it a little further in the next couple of slides, but this concept then tells you what the positive direction of evolution is for consciousness. It's lowering entropy, right? And just from that, we can determine logically what's positive and negative. You know, good versus evil, morality, spiritual growth, and love are all defined as measurable quantities in terms of entropy. Strange idea. Love can be defined as a measurable quantity of entropy. Can be done. Okay, physical reality. What's physical reality? Experience requires interaction, right? Consciousness requires experience. Experience requires interaction. To make that interaction more effective and simpler, we need a very constrained environment. If you don't have a constrained environment and everything is possible, then it's very hard to learn. Learning isn't impossible, but it's very difficult. Think of it. We're all just consciousness. Okay? And we're getting information. We're getting data streams from other consciousness. Do we know whether or not they're telling the truth or lying to us or making it up? Do we know whether they're sane or insane? Do we know whether it's us in our imagination or whether it's coming from the outside? How can we tell? It's just information. We generate information in our own mind, just thinking, our imagination. Okay? You can't tell. There's too many variables loose. You need to constrain it. Okay? You constrain that by creating a local virtual reality that says, all right, we're still going to just trade data, but we're going to trade data within this rule set. We can only trade data according to these rules. Well, in this reality, what's the rule set that we can trade data? It's called physics. You know, F equals ma is part of the rule set. It's just our physics. There's a few other things that physicists haven't gotten yet, but you know, and a few other things that maybe wouldn't even be called physics, but mostly physics is the rule set. So here are all these data streams, but they have to take place according to the rule set. Physics, all right? You drop things, they have to fall, they don't go up. You know, these are the rules. Now think of the virtual reality games that maybe you play, maybe your kids play. You know, things like EverQuest or World of Warcraft. There's bunches of them around, and they may have 1,000 players in them, all playing at the same time. And where's the rule set? Rule set's in the computer. There's certain things that have to happen certain ways, certain things you can do, you know, certain ways that you interact with other people. But these people are interacting with each other, and they're interacting with the set, with the program, according to a rule set. And notice that when they do that, their experience, what they see, is calculated just as they need it. So as you walk around in one of these games, you'll see trees springing up in the background because until they were there, the computer didn't have to put a tree in the background because they weren't there. So the computer doesn't just make trees because it enjoys doing that. That would waste computer cycles. It makes trees because there's some character there interacting in that part of the set, and it needs to put up the trees because the trees are, you know, part of whatever's going on there. Or the orcs, or the monsters, or whatever it is that's in your game. You know, they appear as they need to appear. Well, the same thing works in this reality, and that gets us back to, quantum mechanics. When they make that measurement, something has to appear because that's where they're making a measurement. So something comes into physical being there. That wave function collapses to some physical measurement because there's somebody making a physical measurement. If there's nobody making a physical measurement, then the particle just exists as probability. It's just some probability distribution stays that way because that's its natural state. Somebody comes and looks and says, oh, what slit did this thing go through? And wave function collapses, went through this one. You know, nobody's looking, goes through them both at the same time because it's just probability. So that kind of gives you an idea of where that's coming from. Okay, now physical reality then is digitally based virtual reality where interactions are constrained according to a given rule set. Now the next thing we get to, the last bullet here, says the next level of relativity. Okay, now you know relativity got started by Einstein when he discovered that there was no fundamental inertial frame. That's where the word relativity comes from. There was no fundamental inertial frame, and if you're looking at time and distance, and of course distance per unit time is velocity, if you're looking at time and distance, that it's relative. So we get the name relativity. It depends on the observer. It depends on your frame of reference, and all frames of reference are equal. It's just relative. Well, we step up to the next level of relativity, and we can say there is no absolute fundamental reality frame, okay, within the larger system. This physical universe is not the fundamental reality frame. Sorry that I tell you that, but it is not. Okay? This physical universe is a tiny speck in that larger reality frame. There are lots of reality frames out there that are very similar to this physical universe. There's lots of other physical universes, if you want to put it that way, but of course they're all non-physical because they're outside of this one. All right, I say that not because that's theory, but I say that because I've been there. That's where the consciousness experience comes in. I've been to maybe 20, maybe 30 different physical matter realities that are different. Their physics is different. They don't have the same rule sets we have. Some of them have very similar rule sets. Some of them have very different rule sets. But you can go to these reality frames and they're just as physical as this one when you're in them. And when you're in them, this one isn't physical at all until you come back here. Think of the consciousness. Data streams coming in. Okay, here's the data stream that's our reality, and you kind of just get that one. Well, you just kind of switch over and get in another data stream. You're at a different reality frame. Okay, there is no fundamental reality frame. Now, there are actually thousands of these reality frames. Many of them. They're all virtual realities. What we call non-physical reality, you know, people die, consciousness continues, they go into this non-physical frame, you know, they drop the body in the physical frame. Well, all that happens, you know, again, you can see that. You can go into a non-physical frame, you can watch that person die, you can watch the consciousness make a transition, you can interact with it, you can help with it, you can watch it, you can do this many, many times until you get enough data that you can see what's real and what's not real. Anyway, there are lots of reality frames, but this reality frame that's near to, or interacts with the Earth frame, that's what most people think of as the non-physical. You know, that's where the dead people are, right? They're in the non-physical. They're in the spiritual realm. Well, that's also a virtual reality. That's not the fundamental reality either. That's just another virtual reality. Virtual realities come in all kinds. They come in very constrained, and they kind of look like physical matter realities. They come in unconstrained, and you know, that's like fundamental consciousness. They come in everything in between, which is you know, like your spiritual realities, or somewhere in between. They're all just virtual realities. They're all virtual digital realities. Now, the only thing that is fundamental is consciousness itself. Okay? Origins. Where did it all come from? Okay. When you try to describe what something comes from, you get in this endless regression that says, you know, well, it came from here. Well, then where did that come from? Well, that came from here. Well, where did that come from? Of course, this goes on to infinity. There's an infinite number of those, and you can't really get to the end of that because our knowledge is limited. There's certain limits to our knowledge. We can't know everything. There's some scientists who get upset at that thought, but we can't know everything. And I'll give you a real obvious example. Think of a bacterium living inside your stomach. Okay? A very, very smart bacterium living inside your stomach. Has an IQ of 200. Brilliant bacterium. Okay, now what does that bacterium think about food? Manna from heaven, right? Food just comes. I mean, that's what bacteria do. They decompose food. That's their thing. So they need food. And what do you think they understand about, you know, plows and fields and farmers and horses and cows and trucks and buses and refrigerators and supermarkets and sunshine and rain and all this sort of stuff. What do you think that bacterium knows about those things? Nothing. What could it know about those things? Nothing, even if it was brilliant. Why? Because it's in a subsystem. It can't get out into the supersystem. It can't get out into the larger system. Why not? Because it's limited to the subsystem. And if you're in the subsystem, you just can't understand what's in that supersystem. Now, does that mean that supersystem is just irrelevant? Doesn't matter? Like the scientist that might say, well, that stuff, it really doesn't matter. If we can't compute it, then it's just irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Well, all that stuff is not irrelevant to that bacterium, because what food goes down to that bacterium is very dependent on the rain and the sunshine and the refrigerators and the grocery stores and all that stuff. It just doesn't know. But it is very dependent on that. It affects it tremendously. But it can't know. We're in the same boat. There's things that we just can't know. We can't get there unless we go there. If you can't go there, then you just don't know. And all manner of intellectualizing about it isn't going to get you there. You have to go there. Okay, we do this very much, we treat this very much the way biology treats origins of beginning evolution here. Okay, they say, you have to get to conjecture once you get past your limits of knowing. So they do conjecture and they say, well, you just happen to have the right amount of amino acids and proteins and things, and they were bumping around and they made these chemicals, and the chemicals just happened to get together, as randomness, and out of all the stuff in the ocean, some of them got together and they bound up, and then pretty soon you had a one cell, and that one cell over a very, very long time, learned a few things because it had this tiny little awareness. Tiny little consciousness, if you like, so it learned that maybe two cells are better than one, and it learned, how to move little hairs and grow those little hairs so it could move around. It learned lots of things, and then pretty soon evolution does its thing, and here we are. Here we are tonight. So we do about the same thing. We say that you had consciousness, and that it was a, let's call it primordial consciousness. Just one cell, just like the one cell in the primordial sea. And that it wasn't very bright either. It had just a very tiny little minute amount of awareness. But it was aware that it could be this way or that way. There was a little difference. It had that much awareness, just sort of like that biological cell. And then if it could be this way or that way, then it could be this way or that way and the other way. So as it learned to change state, you see, this way and that way, sort of like a 1 and a 0, isn't it? So it started to do more and more of these. It evolved, just like that thing evolved, and pretty soon, you got consciousness. So it is an evolutionary thing. Consciousness is a real system. Okay, now this assumption that we started out with that says consciousness exists and is it the larger system, well, you have to have this assumption. If you're going to have a big toe, if you're going to get out of the subset, if you're going to get out of that box, at least one of your assumptions in your theory has to be outside of its own causality. If you only work from inside your own causality, you can't get out of the box. Just simple logic. Can't do it. So this assumption is our one assumption that gets us out of the box. Our other single assumption is that evolution exists. And that's not too hard to understand, because we see evolution all around us. All sorts of systems evolve besides biological systems, so that's not hard to understand either. Okay, so the bottom line there is that this assumption that is kind of the leap, this big leap of faith, one, it's right up to the doorway where Einstein went and a lot of other very, very smart people, and said it's got to do something, it has to have something to do with consciousness, and we know it's not continuous, but we just don't know what it is. And then we have Fredkin and others talking about the digital reality, and so you can see where science is getting right to the door, but they can't open the door, because to understand consciousness you have to experience it. It's a personal thing. It's not something you can do objectively, so that's why they got stuck. Okay, so we need this assumption. The fact that we have this one assumption that's not objective isn't like, oh damn, bad physics. It's like, it's necessary. It wouldn't be a big toe without this assumption. Okay. All right, results, some summaries. I'll go over these quickly. The larger consciousness system is an aware, evolving system. It's real and therefore finite. Finite. Many of you think of consciousness as infinite. It's a finite system. All real systems are finite. Infinite systems have to have infinite energy, have to have infinite capacity, and have all these infinite things. They're not real. But infinite is kind of a state of comparison, really. If you're floating in an inner tube in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you look around you, the ocean looks infinite. And after floating around for a week, you're sure it's infinite. But it's not. It's just big compared to you. And that's the way consciousness is. Not an infinite system. It's a real system. It's finite. Okay. Consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy. The larger consciousness system increases its rate of evolution by subdividing portions into itself into smaller units that interact with each other. We are an individuated unit of consciousness, a chip off the old block, one with all that is. Consciousness is it. We're pieces of consciousness. We're one with all that is. Everything is connected. Everybody is connected. Every consciousness entity is connected. Okay? That's because we're all subsets of one thing, one consciousness. Okay? Physical reality is a virtual reality learning lab designed to help budding individuated units of consciousness, called an entity, which is what we are, evolve. That means lower their entropy through experience. Continue the summary. Lowering entropy by improving the organizational profitability of accumulated experience increases the energy, the power, the information available to that evolving entity. If you think about that, remember entropy says lower, or lower randomness, greater organization. But at the same time, that means more energy to do work. You can have a bigger effect. Okay, well, those two go together. As you lower your entropy in consciousness, you get more power, more ability to have an effect. Lowering entropy, spiritual growth, increasing the quality of your consciousness, evolving one's consciousness, and growing up are all different expressions of the same thing. Love is defined as the fundamental expression of a low entropy consciousness. It's not that a low entropy consciousness is loving. A low entropy consciousness fundamentally is love. Next, results. Okay, the larger reality is teeming with life. Okay, that's because evolution is a very robust concept. And as we know in our biology, in our physical biology system, anywhere that the system will support a life form, some sort of life form goes there. Every niche is filled. Well, it's the same in the larger picture, in consciousness that is evolving. Every kind of life form that can be there is there. And this is just a tiny, tiny, tiny little slice of it. It's teeming with life. There's probably billions more life out there than there is life here. Okay? It's full of sentient entities. Okay, many different reality frames or dimensions containing sentient conscious entities exist and are interacting according to their own rule sets. Okay, what does that mean? They're all doing the same thing we're doing pretty much. They're just in different frames. They still have the same job that we do, and that is grow up, interact, decrease the entropy. Why is that their job? Because that's the job of the system. The system exists. It has to lower its entropy. That's how it evolves. There's only 3 states you can be in. You can be evolving, you can be static, standing still, or you can be de-evolving, which is dying. So you're either evolving or you're dying, because being in the middle is unstable. It's an unstable state. You can't just stay the same. Change happens. Everything changes. So you're either evolving or you're dying. So why does the consciousness system evolve? Well, the second choice is a bad choice. So it evolves. How does it evolve? It evolves by lowering its entropy. It evolves by creating a lot of smaller units of consciousness that interact with their free will so they can grow and lower their entropy. Without free will, you can't lower any entropy because you can't learn anything. It's all just a script you're following. Okay. Okay. Growing up means growing toward, becoming means becoming love, and you do that by eliminating fear and ego. The opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. Okay, this is what it looks like. This is just kind of a cartoon to give you a little perspective. What I have in the green circle said PMR, that's our universe, that's our physical reality. And that is a billion times bigger compared to the rest of it than it really is. Okay, that's all of our universe, including us. Now, what's inside of the red line, you see I've labeled that OS. That's our system. That's our physical reality plus all of non-physical, which means other than physical, that interacts with our physical reality. Okay, so all of that stuff where you interact with Uncle Frank who died last week and so on, that's all part of OS. Right? That's all, a lot of the paranormal stuff, the reality that we generally think of as the non-physical is really just this little part that's inside the red ring. That's just that part of that non-physical interacting with us. Because if we interact with it here, then it's defined to be inside that red ring. That's just the part of the non-physical we interact with. Well, what's all this other stuff? Well, everything outside of that red ring is stuff that doesn't know we exist. We have no idea that it exists. It has no idea that we exist. Okay, it's out there. The only way to know about that is to go out there and experience it. Okay, here's other PMRs. This is PMR 1, 2, that's us. Then there's K, dot, 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 K. You can tell I'm a physicist, right? I do things like that. 1, 2, dot, 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 K. These are others because they're different than physical. They're not quite as constrained enough to make it really a physical place, but it's not entirely unconstrained like the rest of this is. But there's lots of these. I just have a few. Like I say, I've been in about 20 or 30 of these. I've been in probably 10 or 12 of these big ones. What are these big ones? Well, the reality is kind of broken up into organizational units that the best way I can say is each one represents a kind of experimental protocol. Okay, it's the way things are done. All of these units are involved in developing consciousness, lowering consciousness entropy. That's what they're all about. But they go about it in different ways. It's different experiments. Our experiment, or the experiment that we're kind of part of, is one of the more lawful experiments. That means there's more rules. Some of these have a lot less rules. Some of them just have different rules. You can't just, if you want to find the best way to lower your entropy, if you're this big consciousness system, you don't just do one thing and say, well, that's good enough. You do everything you can think of. Right? This is evolution. Evolution fills every gap, explores every idea, and sees what works. Well, there's a whole lot more ideas than just the one that creates this physical matter reality, and that's what all these other things are doing. That's what these other physical realities are doing. That's what these other big frames are doing. So within this frame, it's probably, I would say, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably about an 8 in the rule, in the number of rules, and how constrained it is by those rules. Now again, you need rules to constrain things, otherwise you don't have traction as far as your ability to learn. Without the rules that make this physical reality, it's very, very difficult to learn. Think of a football team. I know football means something different to you than it does to me, but it won't matter in this example. Think of a football team, and the football team doesn't have any rules. Maybe it has one rule, and that's get the ball to the goal. And that's the only rule it has. So you got two teams with a bunch of people on both teams, and that's the only rule they have. Would that be an interesting game? No. What would happen? It'd be 0-0 at the end of the last quarter, wouldn't it? Because it would just be this big lump of people, unless one team was a whole lot bigger and stronger than the other. I mean, teams are generally pretty evenly matched. It just wouldn't be much fun. You'd just see a whole bunch of people in a fight for 3 hours, and then you'd go home. It would not be interesting. So we have rules actually makes the game viable. It turns it into a game. It makes something interesting. Something's going on there. There's interaction. There's planning. There's plots. There's strategy. You get all that with rules. If you don't have rules, not much goes on. So rules make a difference. It makes a different game. All of these things are playing a slightly different game. And these big units are playing generally a different game. They're playing rugby, instead. They're doing an entirely different game. Or maybe this one over here is doing basketball. It's a different rule set, but similar. Next. Okay. Some logical implications of all this. What about time and space? Can we visit the past or the future and interact with it? The answer to that is yes. We can go to the future, we can go to the past. There's four things involved here. You know, it's not like you think. You know, it's not that you go back in the past, you change something, and everything changes afterwards. You know, that's a Hollywood thing. It doesn't work like that. The way it works is that the future is not a done deal. It's a probable reality. Hasn't happened yet. What makes it an actual reality is free will, which happens only in the present. Okay, so here we are in the present. This is where our free will gets interacted. And the free will of a rock rolling downhill is just to keep on rolling. It doesn't have a whole lot of decision space. We have a lot more decision space. But all the energy patterns, the storms, the volcanoes, everything, you can predict basically what's going to happen in the next time increment. That's just probability. It's not necessarily going to happen, but you can predict what you think is most likely to happen. Then you go to the next time increment, you can predict what's likely to happen based on the last one happening. So each one is based on the last one happening. You can just predict it on out as far as you want. Couple of problems. One, the further out you get, the rattier your answer gets, because each one's assuming that your last one was true. So your assumptions, your errors in your assumptions are building as you go out. It's the same with probable reality. The further out in time you go, you know, the more likely you are to have error in it. So that's your probable reality. Now, in order to know what is most probable, you can't just say, oh, this is most probable. You have to calculate the probability of everything to know what's most probable. Math is just like that. I know it's annoying, but you have to do the whole thing in order to find out just the one thing you want, right? It's always like that. So it has calculated all of the possibilities that all of the conscious beings and all of the stuff and energy, the storms, the rocks rolling downhill, everything, it's calculated where's going to be the next step. Everything that could happen, you know, might happen, kind of thing. And then you can trace a path through the highest probability you get in all the states. Okay, so that's basically the way that works. So now you have this probable reality out there of everything that could possibly happen, and one of those things does happen the next time increment because we here do our free will thing and something happens. Okay, that's the present. And as soon as we march to the next one, that one we just left drops into the probable, or it drops into the history, right? It's now in the history file. But there's two kinds of history there. There's the history that we actualized, the actualized history. That's the things we actually did with our free will. And there's the unactualized history. That's all those other things that we didn't do. Just like there's all those probabilities that we might do but didn't. All of those become unactualized history. So you've got basically three databases. You've got your future probability, you've got your actualized history, and your unactualized history. And just think of these as databases. Remember, we're only talking about data streams. Think of a big database, and you get to query the database. You query it with your intent. That's how you query the database. Now, you can go into the future probable realities, and you can look around, and you can follow the probability lines, and you can get off the main probability and go through anywhere you want. You can change things and say, well, if I change this, how does that change the probabilities? This is a very nice system. It'll follow your intent. It'll recalculate those probabilities and show you what that might be. Now, that's a pretty handy tool, isn't it? You can do the same thing in the past. You can go back along our history thread, like you could go to, and say, well, what would have happened if Adolf Hitler had won World War II? If he was the winner, and we were the loser, what would have happened there? Well, you can find that out. It'll recalculate those states, and what it'll do is it'll pick every probable thing that would have happened by all the people there. All the people like you and I who were there then are modeled as, as statistical models. Well, you say, that's tough, modeling a person as a statistical model. Well, it's tough for us, but it's not tough for a database that knows every thought we've ever had, every action we've ever taken, every intent we've ever mustered, every feeling we've ever had, because that's all part of the record. So you can make a pretty good model when you have that sort of database, and it doesn't just necessarily go for this life experience. It can go for a lot of life experiences. That's one heck of a database on you. You didn't know you had a record like that, but don't tell any lies when you get over there because it won't work. Anyway, you can visit these places a couple of ways. You can watch it like a movie, where your intent is bringing up the movie of choice, Or you can actually get into it like you're part of the movie. You can join the movie. Then you can change things in that movie and watch it. All you're doing is querying a database that has all the data in it. Okay, it's available to you because your consciousness and what you do is take in data. And those data makes pictures and or feelings or whatever. You know, you got all the data there. So all that's possible. So basically, everything that can happen does happen, but it happens in probability. The only thing that really gets actualized is what our free will does. Now, okay, we have free will and we don't do what was predicted. What happens? Well, the computer just has to start calculating again. We make that computer start over. But it doesn't have to start over and do the whole thing. All it has to do is calculate what changes it has to make in order to make it fit what it is that we really did. Because you have free will, you don't have to do what your model might have said was most probable. You can do something really bizarre if you want to. That works. And actually most of us do, some of the time, do things that are bizarre. That's our right to do that. And when it does, it recalculates. So you might wonder about that. How would you know that you're in these realities? Well, when people have precognitive dreams, basically, while in that dream state, they've gotten some data out of this future probable reality. Right? That's where they get that from. But they don't know that's where they are. You know, it's just an experience. Until you are able to go there enough times that you get the lay of the land, you know what you're doing, you know how it works, you know how to access data in a very particular way, then you just stumble around in these places and you don't know. So that's why you get a lot of confusion. You won't know whether you're in our past history, when you're in what happened, what didn't happen, what could have happened, or where else. If you just wander around in here aimlessly, then you will get a lot of pictures. You'll see a lot of stuff. But exactly what you're seeing, was it something that was on our history thread, or one of those things that could have happened but didn't? You know, that's why your data is sometimes hard to deal with. Okay, let's go on. This is just a real simple rendition of what I just said. Here's OS. Remember, that's our physical reality plus everything non-physical interacts with us. Now, right at this point, it had three choices. It could go to here, to there, or to there. At that point, all of these things are future probable realities, right? And then it makes the choice. It goes over here. As soon as it does that, all of this and all of this become past, right? They're no longer in our future because it made a choice over to here. It can't go there anymore. So all that becomes unactualized history data. All right, now it's over here. It can go to one of these three spots. Everything up here is its potential probable future reality. It makes a choice. Now all of these drop off. And the only thing now that it's in our probable future reality are these, and so on as it marches through. Of course, every delta t, every time it makes a choice, all these lines get spread out more and more and more, and more things are done. So it keeps spreading as it goes. Now I only did 3. That's pretty small. There's really billions and trillions of choices that have to be made to change a state. But if I put billions and trillions of little circles on that page, it just wouldn't be a pretty picture. And that is a pretty picture. All right. So let's go to the next one. This now is that future probability surface. Okay, think of time going out from the origin in all directions. Here's time going out in all directions. And here's the probabilities of events happening, these little green things. So you see near the origin, where time's is close to the now, the present is at the origin, there's a lot of pretty tall probabilities. It's not hard to predict what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes. That's easier. If you try to predict next week, that's harder. Try to predict next year, that's really hard, and the next 10 years, it's harder. Keeps getting harder because the probability, like you come out here, and this probability now smeared out over time. Sometimes they're smeared out in this way over events, because a lot of things might be probable there, so they kind of lose their definition. But occasionally, like out here and maybe here, you can go pretty far out and find something that really has a very distinct probability of happening. And that's the kind of thing that a prognosticator would like to get a hold of, because that has a real high chance of actually happening, even if that's 10 or 15 or 20 years off. Just for its own reasons, it just happens to be that way. All right, next. Okay, logical implications of this. What are the connections between physics, metaphysics, philosophy, religion, all the things I talked about? Well, they are all partial views of the same reality from different perspectives, different beliefs, different assumptions. Okay, they're the same reality, creates all of that. You just look at it from different assumptions. With a big picture perspective, they are all easily understandable as individual shadows of one whole thing, and one can see where and how each got stuck because of their limiting beliefs. And all of these things do get stuck because of their limiting beliefs. Okay? Many of our best philosophers and scientists do accurately see a portion of the big picture. Few have seen the whole picture because they lack the necessary personal experience with and understanding of consciousness. Many, like Einstein, Bohm, and Wigner, knew that consciousness was involved. They just didn't know how. Many successful seekers and enlightened individuals have seen the big picture. You know, for an example, have you ever read Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching? Well, if you have, and if you have experience in the big picture, you'll know that Lao obviously had been there and done that. It rings true. What he says is very accurate description. But it's one of these things where, unless you've been there, it's hard to tell that. And if you don't have any experience, you read it and you go, huh? What is he talking about? It doesn't make any sense. After you've been there, you say, I get it. Yes, that's right. He's been there and done that. Well, most of people who do have experience do end up agreeing. Often there's differences in belief systems, differences in expression, differences in the way they perceived it. But if you get through all of that stuff on the surface and get at what's underneath, you recognize it. We all pretty much see the same thing. And why is that? Because this is one truth. You know, what's true is true. It's not like there's lots of different truths. There's lots of different expressions of truth. And they're all valid. But there's just one truth. So people who actually are seeing the truth ought to agree on what it is that they're seeing. Okay, Fredkin and his digital physics, they're essentially correct too. Right? The reality is basically computed. He just didn't realize that consciousness was the computer. David Deutsch, many worlds. Okay? He's basically right. There are many worlds. It's just they don't exist as parallel physical places. They're probabilistic, non-actualized. They're in the database. Future, past history thread, or past unactualized. There are many worlds. And you can access these worlds. And everything that can happen is there as a probability distribution. So David Deutsch has got that correct. He just doesn't understand the nature of consciousness. Again, you can't unless you experience it. Nick Bostrom, Brian Whitworth, Edward Fredkin, all of them talked about virtual reality being computed reality. It's so. That's true. It's just not as they imagine it. They all miss the consciousness connection because they don't have a personal understanding of the nature of consciousness. And a personal understanding is the only kind of understanding that creates fundamental knowing. Again, you can't handle the subjective objectively. Okay, for the most part, when I tell you about these things, I'm not speculating. Believe that or not, that's true. I speak with confidence only because I've been there, and by experiment and by experience, I've learned the causality of the larger system. Okay, logical implications. What about paranormal phenomena? What are they, and why are they so hard to nail down? Well, they are glimpses of the larger reality, but they don't make sense from the limited viewpoint of this reality. Remember, you can't understand the big picture if you only look with knowledge inside the little picture. Can't do that. So why are they so difficult to study? It's because we're forcing little picture causality on them. Basically, we demand that these paranormal things, which are events of the larger reality, be explained and described physically. We say the non-physical has to be described physically because, you know, the physical is all there is. That's it. You know, we only have this universe, nothing else exists. So if these things exist, you have to be able to explain them physically. It doesn't work. These are things that happen. They're glimpses of the larger reality frame. You cannot explain them physically. It doesn't work. The little subset can't explain the big superset. All right, now there's also a thing called the psi uncertainty principle that limits understanding of psi to some extent. You have to read the book to understand that, but basically what it is part of our rule set, and it's there to keep the integrity of our learning lab intact. You wouldn't want the effectiveness of the learning lab to disappear, which it would otherwise, and we'll talk about that a little later, but there are rules that prohibit, or actually what it does is add an uncertainty to psi things. It requires a certain amount of uncertainty to go with them. All right, logical implications here. Psi phenomena such as remote viewing, healing, out-of-body experiences, exploring, non-physical matter reality, communicating with non-physical beings, telepathy. All these things are natural attributes of, are accessible to, a low entropy consciousness. This is the extra power you get by lowering your entropy. Remember, extra power that you can do things with and can change things with comes with lower entropy, with more organization. One develops a low entropy consciousness by eliminating belief, eliminating fear and ego, and by expanding one's awareness into the bigger picture of existence. That is, by developing oneself spiritually, is another way of saying that. All right, we're going to hit the psi uncertainty principle, just the first bullet. Okay, basically I've told you it's part of the PMR rule set. It represents an entanglement of uncertainty with the measurement of psi effects. Okay, so if you and a few of you get together and you can do some wonderful things, you can do healing, you can do other kinds of things, but what you do kind of stays there. It doesn't, there's a certain amount, from the outside view, from others who aren't part of your circle, particularly skeptical others or scientific others, they come in, there's a lot of uncertainty. Oh, you know, you cheat, you're making it up, you know, you've arranged all this. There's something about it that makes it okay not to believe it. And it'll always be that way. There's always uncertainty involved with what you experience. That's part of the, that's part of the process. Okay, let's go on. Okay, logical implications. What about teleporting? You get around. Well, what does teleporting mean? Basically, in this sense, teleporting is just changing your focus. You get this data stream, you get that data stream, you get a different data stream, you do that with your intent. That's really teleporting. When I go visit another physical reality, that just means another virtual reality that's constrained enough that it kind of has the nature of being physical. Basically, I can go there as an observer, in which case it's like I'm looking at the movie. I can interact with the beings there. I can talk and interact. I usually do that at a level of what would be called their higher consciousness, so they're not aware of it. I can do it so they are aware of it, and if I do that, then they are aware of me as either a voice in their head or it's their own thoughts, their own intuition. If I like, I can produce a body there and walk around and be one of the local people and interact with them that way. You can have your choice of those kinds of things. Now, obviously, if I can do that there, they can do that here, right? It's not just a one-way street. But there are very few entities that are able to do this, so it doesn't happen very often. It's easy to teleport your awareness about the larger consciousness system. It's very easy. And you can go much further than just the non-physical that interacts with our system. That's just a tiny little piece of that non-physical virtual reality that has any interaction with any being here in this physical matter reality. It's easy to generate a body in another frame. It's all just data. It's just a matter of generating the data that when that data goes into their consciousness, they see a physical body. It's easier than it sounds. Okay, logical implications further. Could this have anything to do with UFOs? Well, I don't know for sure because I'm not a UFOologist. I don't follow it. I'm not real interested in it. I really don't care a whole lot about UFOs one way or another. But it occurs to me that many of these UFO experiences could be explained as experiences of consciousness in a different reality frame. You can parallel process reality frames very easily. You can be in 2 or 3 realities at the same time. You just learn to parallel process. I mean, we parallel process a lot. You ever seen a secretary typing, talking on the phone, and talking to somebody else all at the same time? She's just learned to parallel process. And she's writing notes, about something else all going on at once. You just parallel process. You have several things going on at the same time. Well, somebody who just naturally gets into these other frames, and it happens. I mean, you can learn to do it whenever you want to, but sometimes it just happens to people, like it happened to Bob Monroe, that he had these out-of-bodies. You know, he didn't want to do it. He didn't train to do it. It happened. People have all kinds of paranormal experiences. It just happens to them. That's because sometimes their mind gets just in that frame where it makes a connection for some reason, and they have that experience. Well, if you happen to be in this reality frame and you see some other part of some other reality frame, how can you tell them apart? Data's data. It all just looks physical. And if you don't know anything about what I've just been telling you about, you just assume that that's part of this physical reality. So you see these people, you interact with them, and they're here. Well, they're not really here. They're in another reality frame. They just appear to be here because you can't separate one frame from another, because you really don't know what you're doing enough to be able to make that separation. So I think that's what's going on a lot of times. And that doesn't explain everything, you know, that the UFO folks say and do, but it should explain a whole lot of what they experience. Okay. Simultaneously being in parallel reality frames is it happens a lot, and you can learn to do it when you want to. Okay. Question, flaws in the big toe. Have we found anything yet that it doesn't explain? Not yet. We're looking, because these things are important. If you find something that doesn't explain, it explains the physics, it explains the paranormal, it even explains theology. And by that I don't mean it explains every detail in someone's theology. I mean if you look at the fundamental things, the fundamental questions, those things that are functions of the nature of fundamental reality, that's what it explains. It explains all the fundamental questions. Okay, if you find things that it doesn't explain, then terrific. That means there's more exploration needs to be done, more data needs to be taken, and we have to enlarge the theory. If the theory just doesn't and can't be enlarged to explain it, then that means the theory is incomplete, that there's a bigger theory. And we're open to all of that. It just, you know, we're looking to find holes, have not found any yet. All right. Question, what can an aware consciousness do? Answer, what can it do? You are consciousness. You are part of a consciousness system. There's very little that you can't do. There will be some things that you don't have access to, like in those future probability states. You won't get access to those states. You'll be kept from some of them if it's determined that that would increase your entropy rather than reduce it. If it turns out that that's not on your path to growth, to dropping fear, dropping ego, then it's a good chance that you won't get there. You'll be, you know, like most computer systems, you'll get to that little thing where we go beep, you know, access denied. It's that sort of thing. But there is a whole lot that you can do. And as it helps your learning, you know, there's no barriers at all. But you wouldn't want a system that provided you with the tools to, you know, defeat your own intended progress. So the system is trying to help you out there with its access. Can everybody do it? Well, of course everybody can do it. Everybody who's conscious. Anybody in here who's not conscious? Well, all of us can do it then. Okay? We can all do it. But no lawyers? Okay, but everybody doesn't do it. Why not? Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Everybody doesn't do it. Well, everybody could, you know, play the piano in a concert. Everybody could be a brain surgeon or a nuclear physicist. You know, everybody could do any of those things. But most of us don't do those things because we're not interested. It wasn't what came up when we needed something to come up and do. You know, we don't have the time. We don't have the energy. You know, there's just all kinds of reasons, and those are exact same reasons that everybody doesn't do this. They're not interested. You know, they don't have time. It just doesn't come up. So everybody can do it, but that's theoretical in the sense. Everybody theoretically can do it, but very few people really will. You can do it, though. It's your right as consciousness to learn these things. How do you do it? Well, people ask me that a lot, and the first thing I generally tell them is, if you want to understand consciousness, understand your own consciousness first. Don't worry about anybody else's consciousness. You might think that's more fun, but it's going to be less productive for your learning. Understand your own consciousness. I have a very long section in the book 1 that talks about meditation, how to do it, gives you a lot of examples and things. But meditation is not nearly so hard as you think. It's not nearly as difficult or painful as you think. It's really a very simple thing. You just have to stick with it and practice it and always collect evidential data. If you don't collect evidential data, you won't know what you're doing. It'll just be, well, is this real? Well, I don't know. But it's fun, so let's do it some more. But that's rewarding in itself, but it doesn't get you anywhere in the long term. So while you're doing things, you have to always say, what can I do that produces some evidence I can follow up on? If you're right, let's say 70% of the time, or even 50% of the time, okay? Find out what state were you in? What approach did you have when you were right that was different than when you weren't? And you will find that by practice and practice, you'll be able to refine what you're doing, how you're thinking, how you define your intent, and you'll get better and better at it. It just goes little tiny increments at a time. It's not a great leap. It's a lot of work. Collecting evidential data, that's important. There's no shortcuts. You can't take any magic pills. You can't read any magic books. You can't hang out with any great gurus. It's not going to help you. You can do all those things, but it's not going to make you grow even a little bit. Growth has to be from the inside. Growth cannot be pushed on you from the outside. If you're not ready, if you don't take the step, it won't happen. Okay, approach to meditation. Look at the things that are orange there in this chart. Notice, fear nothing, hope for nothing, no analysis, expect nothing, don't compare, don't judge. They're all about things not to do. They're not about things to do. Everyone can meditate naturally. You don't have to learn to meditate. What you have to learn to do is to stop doing the stuff that blocks meditation. Meditation's natural to all of us. It's like breathing. You don't have to really even think about it. You just do it. Your consciousness. But you have to stop blocking doing it. And you block it with your fear. You block it with your expectations. You block it when you constantly want to make it objective and you want to analyze it all the time. Well, what was that? And what did that mean? And was that real? And you get in there jabbering like that. It ruins your meditation. You can't do that. Just experience it. Be a scientist. Just do it and observe. Don't have any expectations about it. Don't be trying to go somewhere with it. Just observe. Okay. Now, this is where I was when I went out to Bob Monroe's. It's where you are now. You know, when I went out to Bob Monroe's, my thoughts were, you know, is this guy nuts or what? Well, you have to be thinking that about me now, because unless you have extensive experience with the larger consciousness system, you can't help but have this question. Because that's the only way you can tell that what I'm telling you is in fact the truth, is to have been there and experienced it. Otherwise, it's all in your intellect, without experience. It's not personal. It's just something you heard, and there's no way you can tell whether it's breakthrough or delusion until you learn to go there and experience it. Most of us, again, that do experience it, we agree pretty much on what's there. It's not that everybody disagrees. Most everybody who goes does agree. You just have to cut through all the various kinds of expression. Leo Lee, you know, it was 2,600 years ago. He figured it out. He was there. You know, he knew what he was talking about. All right, how do you go about it? Well, you have to kind of get off your seat and get up and do it. You don't know whether the pudding recipe is good or whether the pudding itself is good unless you taste it. You got to get involved. If you read my books, you can ask questions. Does what you learn there match with the physical world? When I talk about the physics there, does it match with your own experience, your own subjective experience? You are the world's greatest expert on your own experience. Maybe the only thing you're the world's greatest expert on, but you are the greatest expert on your own personal experience. And if you have experiences, if you've been traveling around and do paranormal things, whatever, these books will explain that to you, and you'll recognize it. And you'll suddenly understand, oh, that's what's been happening to me, and that's why, because it'll all make sense to you. So match your own experience. And everybody, whether you do paranormal things or not, everybody has a, subjective life. Does what these books tell you about your subjective life, is it true? Is that the way your subjective life runs? Well, you can find that out. What this is really about is your big toe. I called the book My Big Toe because I wanted to make the point that it can't be your big toe until you experience it. You have to get out there and experience it. Otherwise, it's just something that your intellect knows about. So the bottom line is find out. Remember, you have to be skeptical. I don't want you to leave here believing what I say any more than I want you to leave here disbelieving what I say. Neither one is productive. Neither one is useful. Neither will take you anywhere important. I want you to leave here committed to find out, to discover big truth for yourself. That's how you grow. Growth is your purpose, your mission. It's your responsibility. Let my big toe be the catalyst for your big toe. Because in the end, that's more the purpose of this lecture and these books than just telling you what reality is all about. That's basically the end of what I've got. If you're interested in finding out more, there are books over here that are inexpensive because you don't have to pay for them to be shipped all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. They were brought over in suitcases, so they were free for shipping. You can go to the discussion. This is the website. There's a discussion group where other people who are reading, have read, get up and talk about things that interest them. The charts will be available. These videos will be available. It'll all be free. It'll be on my website. Vaz will have it at the college. And books you can get. You can buy them at the website, but they'll have to be shipped. You can get them through Amazon. You can get them through Barnes & Noble online. You can go to your favorite bookstore and ask them to order them. There's an international distributor, Baker & Taylor, that distributes them all over. So that's how you can get more information. All right, that gets us to the questions. And how are we doing on time? Okay, we have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Sorry I took some of your questions. But it's a lot to get through. All right, who's got a question? Yes, sir.
Did you say that our emotions are a measure or signifier of our state of conscious entropy?
Emotions, well, yes and no. Emotions can be, aren't all disruptive. Some emotions, obviously, can be disruptive of your consciousness, but all are not that way. Emotions are more feedback for us. It's kind of that meter that you'd like to have of whether or not you are learning, whether or not you're doing the right thing. If your emotions, if your feelings are good, if they're loving emotions, if they're encompassing emotions, if it's emotions that are caring, then you're probably on the right track. If your emotions are disturbing, unsettling, frightening, disheveled, high entropy in the sense that there's a lot of random energy in it, then you're obviously on the wrong track. So the fact that we have emotions is one of our best feedbacks. When you do something, when you get angry and spout something off and you're feeling all this emotion, that's a feedback telling you that you're on the wrong trail. Our emotions are our first feedback. So that's typically what the emotions do for us. They kind of tell us whether we're heading in the right direction or not. All right, other question. Yes, sir.
The theory is fascinating, but the practicality of it seems to be about meditation. And are there any particular meditation techniques that you would recommend? There are hundreds of them.
There are hundreds of them, and whichever one suits you is the best one. And I talk about them in my book. I lay out, I think, if you do all the different combinations in there, there's like 20 or 30 different ways to approach it. But it needs to suit the individual. And what most of the meditation techniques do, they're not necessary to meditate, but they help you meditate, because to meditate you have to let all the jabber go. You have to let all the constant thoughts go. And a process that helps you do this, it's just a tool, meditation's just a tool, is to fill your mind with something that pushes the thoughts away. That's the idea of the mantra. So you keep the mantra in your mind. As long as your mind's filled up with that mantra, it's not thinking about other things. And when that mantra disappears and little thoughts come in, you just put the thoughts aside gently, go back to it. Well, the mantra is just fluff. It's just stuff to push the thoughts away. Eventually, when you develop your conscious control enough to the point that you don't need that mantra to keep those thoughts away, let go of the mantra. It's not useful anymore. There's nothing magic or sacred about the mantra. You can make up mantras. It's not hard to make up. It's just a thing that lets you keep thoughts at bay. You can do that by let your eyes trace a mandala. It's another way. You can do it by listening to music. You can do that by seeing lights in different patterns. You can bring up an image in your mind of something that will concentrate. Here's one. You can bring up an image of a soccer ball, because soccer balls have those nice white and black spots. And look at that soccer ball. Then rotate the soccer ball quickly at first, and then slow it down. Slow it down and hold it, and you'll see, because you're so preoccupied with that soccer ball, all the rest of your thoughts are gone. Well, in the end, you want to let the soccer ball go too. But it's a tool, just like a mantra, to push the extraneous thoughts out of your mind. It's a training to get rid of those thoughts. But yes, meditation's very good, and there's 100 ways to do it, and they're all valid. Some people like one better than another. I'd say try as many as you need to till you find something that works with you. Another question? Yes, ma'am?
Are we moving towards a time where we all have a lower entropy consciousness?
Yes and no. The bad news is, it's not just going to happen without you earning it. You don't get lower entropy, and your consciousness does not just suddenly grow up because you're in that grow-up cosmic cycle. It doesn't work like that. I know there's a lot of that out in the literature, but you don't get it for free. There's no free lunch here. You have to develop it. You have to grow up, and that has to be from the inside out. So no, there's not going to be like one day we'll all wake up and be enlightened. Won't happen. Doesn't work that way. That's not the point of what's going on here. But the good news is that yes, we're all striving. We're all working on it. All the beings in all of those realities are all working on it. Entropy is being decreased little tiny increments at a time by lots of people.